Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing another new fantasy releases wrap up. The 3 books we'll be chatting about would be The God and the Gumiho, The Lost Story, and The Honey Witch. As always, I'll have timestamps and links in the description bar down below in case you'd like to bounce between these or reference back to them at a future date. Before jumping into it, a big thank you to Book of the Month for working with me on today's video. I recently picked up A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher through Book of the Month's audiobook service, and it has been one of my favorite books of this year. I can't wait to talk about it further. I was already highly anticipating this because it is T. Kingfisher, so I was so excited when I saw the audiobook was available through Book of the Month. I listened to it. I loved it. It is officially one of my new favorite T. Kingfisher books, but also just one of the best things I've read this year. Such a great fall read. It's the perfect blend of horror and fantasy, which I just think T. Kingfisher excels at. But some other books that I have picked up from them that I greatly enjoyed, we have Keikei, we have Dragon Fruit, Mame, which is a non-fantasy story, and this one was, I thought, really representative of something that I experience, which is taking care of a loved one as they are dying. And then actually, fun surprise, I got a thriller for this season because I thought it'd be fun to dip my toes into a different genre, so I do look forward to trying that one out. And I am excited because Book of the Month often follows through with having fantasy sequels, so I also got a fantasy sequel as of late. If you're interested in checking out Book of the Month, you can get your first book for $5 with the code Cardigan. A big thank you again to Book of the Month for working with me today. Now on to our new fantasy releases. Jumping into it, I'm going to start with The God and the Gumiho. This is a book that I couldn't quite determine what I was getting into when I was planning on picking this up, and I actually was kind of looking forward to that and just discovering for myself what age range it actually fits into. Is this fantasy? Is this fantasy romance? Is this more urban fantasy? And the tiniest bit, I really don't want to give anybody the wrong impression, so I really just mean there's a sprinkle of this. It reminded me of the Dresden Files, specifically because you're looking at relatively modern society and you're looking at 2 individuals who they're living among humans, but they're very aware of the paranormal beings that exist around them. The paranormal beings in this instance are Korean mythology inspired, which I really enjoyed seeing, and I enjoyed getting to hear more about what is expected from certain beings, what their weaknesses are, how they go about living their lives, and what the protocol is for dealing with them. And that's the part that I think is where I'm getting this comparison to Dresden Files. As of these 2 individuals, the God and the Gumiho, the God is a fallen god who, in order to try and restore his godhood, has to spend a very long time trying to basically arrest unrulies, the creatures that wreak havoc and go outside of law. So he is essentially a detective. He is very grumpy. He hates humans pretty much. He hates everything on earth with the exception of coffee. And then you switch over to the Gumiho, who is somebody who enjoys life. She likes all of the sweet things. She likes fun things. She likes pop music, and she just likes looking pretty, and she's just very flowery and fun and carefree, but she has a dark past in that while she's a Gumiho and they are allowed to live and roam free, they are not allowed to actually tap into that instinct of theirs, which is to eat the livers of men. However, our main character, you discover, is somebody who, and this isn't a spoiler, this is just a part of who she is somebody who was known as the Scarlet Fox. She has a long history of going through and getting her fill of humans, and she did so for many years, and that is in part why there's so many restrictions on Gumiho now. So in present day, she's kind of gotten her fill, and she's just living life pretty much like a person. She works at this cafe called the Creature Cafe, where a lot of individuals who are not necessarily humans come in, and also the people she works with and for are not necessarily humans. And it is here as a barista that she encounters the god who is getting his coffee, his daily coffee, so that he can do his job. And she ends up accidentally kind of getting her friend, who is also Gumiho, her first taste of human. And the people, she's thinking, well, these were bad guys, so who cares? And my friend's never had a taste, so I'm gonna let her have some. But this very quickly puts her friend under the threat of the god character. His name is Soka, and the main other character, the Gumiho, is named Hani. And Hani realizes, oh my gosh, now my friend is potentially under threat of investigation. I need to find a way to throw off the case. So she ends up getting a position as the assistant to Ahsoka. And it is through this position that she is trying to completely derail the investigation. And in doing this, she's actually coming to find that there is a lot more to Ahsoka than she realized, and that she maybe wants to help him accomplish some of his goals while trying to keep his eyes away from the Scarlet Fox, who is the person they believe has committed the acts of violence at the beginning of the story. So you're seeing these two cross paths. They have very drastically different personalities. The Scarlet Fox is not the only individual that Sokka is interested in trying to find. In fact, his main person that he is looking for is actually this being that can result in pretty much wreaking havoc on all of mankind if they're not stopped, and they have the ability to completely end a god's life. In their world, gods typically don't permanently die, they just are eventually reborn, but this individual, this being, has the ability to completely unravel a god's soul, and thus would result in them not being able to come back. So they're not only a threat to humans and other kinds of beings, but they are also a threat to Sokka himself. And in becoming his apprentice, Hani realizes that she probably should help him with this case and just kind of help keep things quiet about the Scarlet Fox so that he doesn't get onto her or her friend. The Korean mythology elements to this were a lot of fun. It was just really exciting to see something different from what you typically find in urban fantasy type of stories. And then on top of that, I did enjoy the dynamic between the two main characters, the grouchy character and the sunshine character. Initially, I actually almost DNF'd this book because I really wasn't sure what I was getting into, and when I first started it, it was very carefree and rather modern feeling, which makes sense because it has more of an urban fantasy feel. But when I hear about these beings that are thousands of years old, I tend to expect them to behave a little differently, and instead these two really honestly act like teenagers. But if you go into it knowing that that's more so what you're going to get, I think it probably will irk you less or not at all. It's just a matter of having your expectations accurate, I think. And on top of that, the way they interacted with each other was rather juvenile and immature. And this was the part that I really was like, oof, I don't know. There's a part where they basically have a staring contest because they're both mad at each other. And it's not like it lasts for a really long time, but they're taking it very seriously. And then Sokka, to sort of win the staring contest, just blows in her face. And she's like, you cheated. And I'm kind of like, are you guys supposed to be solving this really important murder situation? And it was funny because when I was telling my husband Sean about this book, he was like, at least they're not playing tic-tac-toe. And the reason he said that, some of you may know, there's a book called A Game of Fate, and they play, I lied, not tic-tac-toe. That would be funny though, not tic-tac-toe, sorry. They play rock, paper, scissors. So my husband was like, at least they didn't play rock, paper, scissors. And I was like, that's true, because in A Game of Fate, which was not a book that ended up working for me, they play rock, paper, scissors. But anyway, then at one point in the book, they did play rock, paper, scissors, and my husband had just gotten ready to go to bed, so I nudged him because I was reading in bed next to him. I nudged him and I was like, they just played rock, paper, scissors, and he knew immediately what I was talking about and started laughing. But anyway, so they have a relatively silly, rather juvenile way of talking with one another for a lot of it, but the whole thing is fun and silly and goofy. It doesn't take itself too seriously. They're kind of self-aware of the fact that they behave stupidly, in that there's a part where she even says, Hani even tells Sokka, like, you are thousands of years old and you're acting like a baby. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. I'm glad the book is aware of itself. To me, the whole thing kind of felt like watching a silly anime show where you have those two characters that are really almost caricatures of a type, where he is this grumpy fallen god and she is this beautiful and silly Gumiho. And there's something about the way that they interact with each other. It just feels like an anime in book form. And I think when I sort of started to reframe it in that way, I was like, I could absolutely see myself throwing this on and having a good time watching these characters be absolutely ridiculous with each other. There were the occasional moments that were more mature or that were a little bit more emotional, not to the degree that my absolute favorites tend to have, but they were present. It just did kind of fully encompass the ways in which people are obnoxious, you could say, but ultimately they're both striving for something. There's a plot that's always pushing it forward, and there's a lot of fun fantasy elements and mythology mixed in. So it was a good time. I really do feel like the best way to describe it is like if it was a fun anime in a book form with a tiny, tiny, tiny sprinkle of Dresden Files. So make of that what you will. Next up, we have The Lost Story. This is a book that is written by an author who previously had wrote something that was similarly very, very sweet. The other thing they wrote would be The Wishing Game, and that story was essentially a retelling of, or at least inspired by, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and it had the found family. It was very wholesome and sweet, but it definitely shed light on some very serious topics like children who kind of get lost in the system, who are a part of foster care, waiting to be adopted. It showcased that. It also talked about being in bad relationships, and also when society expects certain things of you and the way it can completely ruin your life. It tackled a lot of really important themes while remaining primarily focused on the ways in which people can bring out the best in each other, that found family, and that sweetness. And I did really, really like that. This story also had kind of that cotton candy sweetness to it. The reason it didn't quite hit the same for me as The Wishing Game is because there was something about having a small child and an elderly man in The Wishing Game where those cotton candy sweet moments just felt so precious. Whereas in The Lost Story, essentially everybody is an adult. So it just didn't quite feel as genuine in a sense. It almost felt like that's not quite how people often really are. And I don't think that's going to be the case for a lot of people. I think the best thing to compare it to in its tone is House in the Cerulean Sea, which a lot of people really, really love. And that one is one that didn't quite work for me, but I do think that there are a lot of parallels between them. And there were some really emotional moments in this. Because so much of it is so sweet, when it does hit those parts that are a lot heavier, I was actually quite taken aback, and they did almost get me. I gotta say, I was reading and I was like, oh my gosh, about some of those moments. I don't want to reveal too much because a lot of this story is discovering what has happened in these characters' lives. The setup is that you have these two young boys that went missing when they were young, and then 6 months later they were found, and they should have been completely disheveled, emaciated, and unhealthy, and instead they seemed like, aside from some injuries they'd sustained, they seemed even healthier than before they went missing, and nobody understands how that's possible. People think that nothing bad happened and they just ran away, and some people think they were tricking the entire town, and you don't really know what happened in the 6 months they were gone. You also don't know what happened that led them to go out into the middle of the woods where they were eventually lost, but that happened when they were young. Now they're both adults. One of them doesn't remember anything that happened when they went missing, and the other one does, but won't say anything. And the reason these two end up coming back into each other's lives is because a young woman has heard the reputation of the one who happens to remember what transpired when they were missing. That one now has this almost sixth sense when it comes to discovering missing people. And as a result, this other character comes into the picture because her sister went missing years ago, and she is rather certain she's probably passed away, but she does at least want to find her or find out what happened to her, just to have some sense of peace for her. And so these three end up coming together, and it turns out that the missing sister somehow has some kind of connection to the young men when they went missing, and so everything is connected somehow, and as you're reading through it, you're discovering those mysteries. I thought that the themes were executed exceptionally, despite the fact that the tone of the story didn't quite work for me. I think the themes are going to really resonate with some people. A lot of it has to do with having abusive people in your life, or having people that place certain expectations on you as a result of either their view of the world, their view of society, the way you're supposed to be, or probably also elements of generational trauma, how they were treated when they were young, how their worldview was imposed onto them from people from before, and they just can't seem to allow other people to live differently from them, and the effects of that. And when you start to see all of that unfolding throughout the story with the specifics, it is really devastating. However, there is, similar to the Wishing Game, such a strong sense of found family. There are some fun narrative decisions. In particular, there is somebody who is telling you the story, and they do break the fourth wall and actually talk directly to you, not in the typical first-person kind of way, but rather they're aware of the story being a story. So they'll tell you like, okay, I'm your narrator, and in every single fantasy fairy tale, there's always got to be this kind of character and this kind of character. So they're telling you like the ingredients. Can you figure out who represents what? I thought that was kind of fun. It was cute. It was different. The fantasy elements themselves are especially soft though. I by no means would say this fits within a traditional magic system, nor does it necessarily play off of already familiar terrain. It just kind of feels like whatever comes at you. It's almost Alice in Wonderland like, where they're traversing and then suddenly it's like, oh, by the way, this happens or this can happen and this exists, and you're just like, okay, and you're just supposed to roll with it, which actually kind of worked in this story, I think, because it wasn't I can't really say why it works, to be honest, but it does, because when you realize how the world came to be and the lore of the world, I'll say, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Because when I first stumbled upon some of the antagonists in this, I was like, really? That's an interesting choice. But it made a lot more sense as things progressed. So this is a book that kind of grew on me the more I read, but at the end of the day, I would say it's not necessarily... it didn't exactly fit my taste, but I would still definitely, one, recommend it, and two, I definitely think it has a lot to offer that a lot of people are going to really, really connect with. And then last for today, we have The Honey Witch. This is a story where you're following a young woman in this sort of Regency era setting, and there's a lot of pressure on her to get married, to become someone's wife, and to become a mother and just kind of fulfill this traditional role. However, there's just something that is always called out to her that doesn't feel connected to any of those things. And very quickly at the beginning of the story, it is discovered that she is a part of a family of witches, and her grandmother wants to be able to teach her about all of that, about magic, about how to use magic to help other people. The magic itself was interesting in that there are sort of these two opposing kinds. There's ash magic and honey magic, and the way in which they are opposing I thought was actually kind of really interesting and unique. I'd not really seen something like that before. And as far as the themes throughout the story, when I first began, I was like, our main character is kind of annoying and judgmental. And I don't know how much I like her, but I feel like it's intentional, so let's see. Something I appreciated about this story is that even though she wants this life for herself, the life where she can explore magic, she can explore her passion, and she can explore what it means to be a witch, to help other people, to help heal people, to help provide for the community. And while all those things are great and good, and it's wonderful that she's able to have the opportunity to pursue the life that she wants, she does definitely look down at people who want that more traditional role she didn't want for herself. So it's not just a matter of, I want the freedom to choose, it's that I think I'm choosing the superior role, and people who want this role over here are needy or they're not independent enough. And she has these negative views of these people. And I really was surprised and respected the fact that, one, we started with a flawed character who has this view, because I think it's risky to start with, honestly, let's be honest, an obnoxious character. It's a little off-putting when you first pick up the book, because I almost was tempted to DNF this one too, because I thought, I really am not a fan of her, but I'm trusting that this is intentional, that we're going to see growth, because if you're going to see a good character arc, you do need to start them in a place where they're probably having room for improvement, we'll say. And I do think the author did that. I don't want to go through too much of how and what happens and what changes the character's mind or anything like that. But I think very much something that's sort of a catalyst for growth for the story, without going into too much detail, is just loneliness, grief, and the prices that you have to pay when you decide to live your life in a certain manner. It's sort of this look at, well, if you have any path in front of you, no matter what you choose, there's going to be a different life that has certain elements to it that might seem appealing that you lose a little bit of when you choose a different path. And so I think that was explored really well. I did find, however, and the reason that this book ultimately didn't quite work for me, is that while I appreciated the character's growth And I also really appreciated the relationships throughout the story. The friendships in this were quite cute. The family relationships were really well done. And everything with her grandma was probably the best part of the book, in my opinion. But despite those things, I just felt like the, I guess you could say, antagonistic element to the story was not as present as I felt it needed to be for how high the stakes ended up getting and where things ended up. I wish we had explored the setting a little bit more, the stakes a little bit more, and this antagonistic force. I don't want to reveal too much, so I'm trying to purposefully be vague when I talk about that. But I do wish we'd kind of had a little more time with those things. And I think if we had, I would have cared a little bit more. This story, I thought it might maybe lean into cozy territory. And maybe for some readers it will, but I wouldn't quite categorize it as cozy. And I also was wondering, okay, is this going to be more of a romance? And it has a romantic subplot in it, but I wouldn't say the romance is the number one thing. I do think that the themes drive a lot of the story, which is nice, but to really represent the themes, I do think that that antagonistic force, sorry to keep using that phrase, that really had to play a role in pushing the themes forward, but they didn't feel as fleshed out as I would have wanted, so they just kind of felt like when they finally did pop up, it was sort of just like, oh, here I am. And I almost think a quieter type of story and maybe leaning in more into the setting and really showcasing that. And we do have a sense of found family, but I think if we'd also tapped into that a little bit more, I just think that we had a lot of places that maybe for my personal taste I would have like expanded on, but because we didn't expand on those things, the whole thing just resulted in a good reading experience, but it wasn't as exceptional for me as maybe I was hoping with the kinds of themes that we were looking at. And I think also I really was hoping for a little bit more, this is going to sound strange, but a little bit more witchiness. There is the whole witch element of the story, but I think we could have had a little more of that as well. I do want to highlight, though, as I said a moment earlier, the elements with her grandmother, the scenes with her grandmother, everything surrounding that bond, I thought were very beautiful, and it made me quite sad. A number of the things that were touched on with that, and just your loved ones, and especially just grandmas in general, that definitely got me quite a lot. So I will say overall, I found a lot of these works to be, for my taste, like they didn't quite hit, but I wasn't upset about any of them. I didn't think any of these were bad. I definitely would be willing to read other works by these authors. I mean, The God and the Gumiho was a lot of fun, as I talked about. And I've obviously liked something else by Meg Schaefer. As far as Sydney J. Shields, I would read something else by this author. This one just didn't quite hit. But yeah, these were kind of a mix of possibilities. As I said before, if you are interested in checking any of these out, I will have them in the description bar. A big thank you again to Book of the Month for working with me on this video. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.